Thank you, Glenn. You talked about big money. You didn't talk about big philanthropy. Can you talk a little bit about the role of big philanthropy in Massachusetts, the good, the bad, and the ugly?
I talked about it briefly. Big philanthropy in Massachusetts largely is stemming from the Boston Foundation. And most of the unions, most of the school boards have not associated with them. Big philanthropy, the smaller, somewhat progressive charitable trusts have been helpful in supporting research, but not to the extent that big philanthropy has supported enhancing the authority of school-based managers, promoting charter schools, promoting charter alternatives, and attacking the unions. I mean, they're probably good in other, whenever there's a big issue, the head of the Boston Foundation shows up at the State House with 27 civic leaders, all of whom get money from him, and they try to create the appearance of, and the Boston Globe picks it up because the Boston Globe historically has been, anybody from Boston here, the history of the Globe was very anti-Catholic, very anti-Irish, and anything associated with it, like the unions. So the teachers' unions, the Globe has up to a couple of years ago not been particularly sympathetic to the unions and has been pretty much on board with the agenda of the foundations. That may be starting to change under some of the new management, but the editorial page is still leaning to the right on education.
You briefly talked about the financial bit. You kind of had to go fast. I'd like you to focus a little bit more on the financial aspect of what happened in Massachusetts.
Okay. On the financial side, the state established a minimum base budget for every district called the foundation budget. And the foundation budget is legally and technically adequate. But about 2/3 of our districts spend above the foundation budget, and they're on the hook for 100% of everything over the foundation budget. But before you get to the foundation budget, the state determines how much of it you can afford to pay based on the wealth of the community, and then the state gives you the rest. So if you're an economically disadvantaged community, you might get 85% of your money from the state. If you're a wealthy community, you might get as little as 17 or 18% of your money from the state. And we argue that I think the foundation budget is about 20% understated.
So in Rhode Island, it's known as a core instructional amount, and based on the foundation, our formula isn't truly a foundation-based formula. What the state does is it determines, based on community wealth and based on the size of your population and based on a student success factor, which until recently was predicated on free and reduced lunch. You got a weight for that, a 0.4 weight. They would determine how much, based on those other factors, your community wealth, your property tax wealth, median family income, how much the state would fund, and then the local is supposed to fund the rest of it. In most foundation-based formulas, the formula actually articulates what that percentage is in the formula. We don't do it that way. We say, here's what the state's going to get you, and the rest of it should come from your municipal government. They don't necessarily dictate that. But the problem with, and I'm sure Glenn will talk about this as well, the core instructional amount doesn't necessarily cover everything it needs to. For instance, in a lot of states, transportation is part of the core instructional amount. It's not part of the core instructional amount in Rhode Island. So, and then again, there are a whole host of expenses. They're not going to fund you for the football and the hockey team. All of those things are, a local function. So that's how it works in Rhode Island. It's somewhat similar. There's a core instructional amount that the state funds based on their formula. Traditionally, they would identify a mill rate or a tax rate that has to be levied at the local level to meet the rest of the requirements of the core instructional amount. We don't do that. So in some communities, Woonsocket is a good example. What happens is the municipal government freezes the appropriation year in and year out and shortchanges the school district.
You had mentioned teacher evaluation.
Teacher evaluation.
Okay, so since that has changed in Massachusetts, what happens to the results of teacher evaluations? How are they shared? Do school committees typically get information on how, not by name, but how the teachers do in general, and what happens? How are they funding remediation?
Yeah, you can get aggregate information. The teacher's evaluation tool is a confidential personnel document, but school committees will often ask, did we evaluate 100% of the teachers we were supposed to? How many of our teachers are exemplary versus proficient versus needs improvement versus unsuccessful? And if they have a good superintendent, a discussion with the superintendent about this, you can get some interesting data about how well you're doing. Now, there is a way, but I don't know that anyone's taken the time to do it, to tie student achievement to individual teachers. This whole evaluation system was created, it was a massive process, and it took a very long time. And what broke the ice was the unions agreed that they would allow student data to be incorporated into the teacher evaluation system, subject to collective bargaining. And that they would allow merit pay for performance, to be paid in districts, subject to collective bargaining, which meant that the unions had to want to bargain it, and we had to want to bargain it too. And we knew it was all BS, but the commissioner and his buddy Arnie Duncan declared victory and said, here in Massachusetts, we have paid for performance, and we have student performance data used in the evaluation of teachers. And all the teachers got upset and had no idea that their union representatives on that bargaining team pulled a big rabbit out of a big hat for them, and never understood that they made all these reforms but made them all subject to bargaining. So as a result, they never got implemented. But of course, for the commissioner, it wasn't about really doing it. It was about becoming the U.S. Secretary of Education, which never happened. We ended up with somebody better. About 5% of our teachers are determined to be underperforming or in need of improvement, and there is a bargained, extensive remediation process, but it is easier to remove a teacher because the process prescribes you need to make measured progress based on site visits, unannounced visits, and other data that's mutually agreed to. So we've had people leaving the system. We've had people leaving the profession who should never have been in it in the first place. When I was first elected, I was married to a teacher, and I said, I still am, and I said, yeah, 26 happy years and another 14, anyway, I said, what percentage of the people in your school shouldn't be in the business? Because I can tell you, my gut in Cambridge, a third of them shouldn't be in the business. And she said about a third. And now when we have that discussion, and I have it with my daughter who's a teacher as well, I say, very, very few. So I think it's been an effective evaluation system, even though it's this thick.
How does Massachusetts prioritize the funding? I mean, so
How do they what?
prioritize funding? There was discussion about the formula and how they distribute.
Oh, how do you make it equal?
Distribute the money. No, where does it come from? How do they allocate it to education? How do they fill the pot, so to speak, at the top? Where does that come from? In Rhode Island, it's very unclear. And I think, as everyone talked about earlier, you hear about, well, it'd be great if we spent $200 a year and you knew it went to education. And most Rhode Islanders would say, yeah, no, that would never happen. How is it different in Massachusetts?
Are you talking about the state allocates a line item of state aid to education, and it distributes in statute how much money goes to every district? Is that?
I think what he's talking about is
I'm sorry.
in for instance, the $2.2 billion that we spend on education aid in the state,
Okay.
combination state, local, federal. Of that, over, I'd say close to 59% of it is property tax driven. So, like all states in the Northeast, there's an over-reliance on property taxes to fund education. Rhode Island happens to be particularly worse.
59?
59%.
It's about the same in Massachusetts. I think the foundation is 40, the Chapter 70 is about 41% from the state. Now, there's also a special education circuit breaker, and there's regional transportation and charter school mitigation and a few other things. But basically, it's about the same, if 59 is the number. The sources at the state level are the basic state aid to education, which is called the Chapter 70 allocation, and that's about 4 point something billion. Then there's 350 million from the special education circuit breaker. There's probably another 70 million in regional transportation and maybe 60 million in charter school mitigation. Is that what you're thinking about? Is that?
Don't you have some money that goes directly into education from lottery sales?
Oh, okay. The money from the lottery goes directly to the municipality for whatever the municipality wants. Lottery money doesn't go to state education directly. However, 1% of the state's sales tax goes to the school building formula.
And that's kind of key. I mean, when you start talking about, everybody says the lottery money or the new gambling money, which doesn't exist at Twin River, by the way. Like I've said in the past, my late uncle could have done a much better job of calculating the odds on the NCAA and Super Bowl and give a lot of advice to the state because we're losing a lot of money there. But unless you cite, like they did in Massachusetts for school construction, a specific need, everything's fungible. So if you say the lottery money is going to go to education, then they just ratably reduce from the income tax revenues what you get, or from the sales tax. So what they did in Massachusetts, which we cannot do here, they allocate about $900 million annually on a 1 cent sales tax goes to fund infrastructure repair.
And what we're also looking at, we're looking at money from the new casino, which is, we've had one casino that opened up in Springfield and another one that's going to open up in the middle of the worst traffic situation already in the history of Massachusetts. The new casino's going to open up there. And we've got Plain Ridge. We're looking at that casino money. We have elected, interestingly enough, to defer on sports betting, which, you know, Tim talked about his uncle. I am the grandson of a bookie. I'm sorry, but that's what he was. He was a very wonderful grandfather, but he and his father were bookmakers. So I have some knowledge of the volume of money that is wagered on sports. And if we could only get the State Lottery Commission authorized to do it through the lottery, and you wouldn't have to go to the track, which is what you have to do now. You got to go to Lincoln in order to bet on sports. Well, if you could go to the 7-Eleven and you know, play your teams, there's a ton of money waiting out there.
We're ahead of you on that.
Oh, you are?
It's called an app.
An app.
So now you'll be able to do it over your cell phone. That legislation is making,
But
with
can you
lightning speed.
Can you tax it, though?
With lightning speed, oh yeah, because you
Okay.
have to open an account. But it's moving with lightning speed. Unlike anything else the legislature does, the ability to wager on sports teams on your cell phone will be enacted in short order.
I'm still stuck.
sorry.
I'm still stuck on this issue of financing money that comes from the state level. Because I think one of the things that made Massachusetts so successful was the outsized financial sustained commitment that the state made. And I'm wondering about the state of Rhode Island. When we say, okay, now we have a new way to generate gambling money, we'll take some of that. Do we add that to the kitty, or do we reshuffle the money around and it's still the same amount? I'm wondering if we could ever do what Massachusetts does unless we really increase our financial commitment at the state level.
Everything goes into the general fund. So in terms of gambling money, once we start smoking marijuana, that's all going into the general fund. So the governor has rated whatever restricted accounts are out there. For instance, The Rhode Island Resource Recovery, which is popularly known as the landfill, had a $4.5 million reserve set aside for recycling and educational programs. She scooped that. Even the set-aside money at 911, which generates, which is a tax on your cell phones and your landlines, generates about $16 million a year. And in defiance of federal law, it does not go back to 911. It goes into the general fund. 911's appropriation is about $9 million. So the state's netting out about $7 million there. And there's federal regulations relative to spending the money on 911 enhancements or lowering the assessment that we're charging on cell phones and landlines. So essentially in Rhode Island, almost everything goes into general revenues and then are appropriated out by the legislative process. We do have a funding formula that determines and drives what the state has to appropriate for education. But again, there are so many what are known as categorical funds. So you have categorical funds for early childhood. You have categorical funds for transportation. You have categorical funds for high-cost special ed. You have categorical funds for ELLs. The problem with categorical funds are in any given year, and this is what is concerning me in this particular year, they can be frozen. $4.5 million for high-cost special ed has been frozen for the last 4 years. What's the formula that drives that? And the formula is in and of itself is amazing. You only get $1 of reimbursement when your student exceeds 5 times the core instructional amount. That's roughly $75,000. So that special ed student you pay for up to $75,000, and then the state starts reimbursing you for every dollar above that, except they don't, because they don't fully fund it. They prorate it. So what are you getting? You're getting 25 cents on the dollar. That's how the state runs the system on categorical funding. Woefully underfunded on ELL, woefully underfunded on early childhood, woefully underfunded on high-cost special ed, and woefully underfunded on transportation. So when somebody sits there and says the gambling money is going to go to education, all they're going to do is ratably reduce what you get from other funding sources. It has to be identified as a specific need. If they said the new gambling money is going to be used exclusively for technology acquisition, that would be something. But that's not what they do. I'm sorry, I'm
No, that's
stepping
it.
all
No,
over Glenn's.
Same issues in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that there's no commitment to it. I mean, our district gets a paltry sum of money from the state. Meanwhile, we have all these state level mandates that we have to fulfill.
Well, and again, you know, it's not going to be the panacea. It's not going to be the perfect solution. But from our estimation and the board of directors of the Rhode Island Association of School Committees, until a student can walk into a court and say, I'm being shortchanged, the system will never provide what it needs to provide. But with that, I think lunch is on the table or on the buffet. Thank you, Glenn.